Hello beautiful people, Vida from Bookbindersbuddy is here. Today I'm gonna share my nightmare story with you. Well, I love make books, but this one was kind of too harsh for me. And I'll tell you why. The idea of this notebook was to make pages longer than the book cover, prolonging them by sewing extra pieces of paper. A little bit of white paper, also a little bit of pretty exotic handmade paper. At first, it seemed I'll just need a couple of extra hours to do so, but it took me days. I've spent over 50 hours on attaching white narrow strips of paper only. Over 50 hours, not 15, but 50. I wanted to create beauty in imperfection. We have a saying that work makes a man beautiful, and Lithuanians have always been proud of people who work hard, because through dirt, sweat, and tears, a man can create great and beautiful things. Nothing happens by itself. Whether a person does physical work or mental work, he has to put long hours to make something beautiful and with quality and value. That is why I wanted to create a book with watercolor sheets of paper inside, so that the artist who draws in this book in the future will have a constant reminder that perfection requires skill and a good result requires work. No matter how difficult or desperate things may seem, person has to keep going and keep working forward. In small steps, continuously, without fear of mistakes and failures, learning from yourself, seeing what can be fixed or improved. And I chose to sew those little narrow strips of paper as a symbol of many small repetitive steps, revealing the beauty that can be created through diligence. But to be honest, I was hoping to do it all in 1 week, and it didn't happen. I worked 4 hours every working day on this project, and after a week I started to doubt whether I should continue. I started to realize that these routine actions like punching and sewing, punching and sewing, punching and sewing at first relaxed me and put me in a meditative mood, but after a few days it started to become boring. Not because I was no longer able to immerse myself in the stillness and meditation, but because the impatience to do the next step, such as attaching exotic handmade paper and creating a cover, started to burn inside me. Every day this impatience burned like a fire, and it became harder and harder to concentrate on my work. After 2 weeks of sewing, the last 3 or 4 days I had to force myself to stitch and sew strips on white paper. And finally, after more than 50 hours, that part of this job was finished. Then, of course, it was the turn of the beautiful handmade paper strips, which also took me more than a week. I must admit, there were days then I wanted to stop the project and never go back to it. So, at some point, I stopped filming the process. But too much time and precious paper was invested in this book, so it had to be finished anyway. Now let's talk about the cover of this book. By mistake, I lost almost all the footage of the cover creation process, but I want to tell you about the challenges I faced in this process, because it is also a nightmare story that made me cry. First of all, the cover is made up of eco leather leftovers and scraps. As you can see, I sewed them together to get big sections that fit together nicely. As I always had the ocean theme in my head, I wanted to relate the cover to the ocean and waves as well. So I cut and sewed blue details from eco leather to represent ocean waves. But the biggest diamond on this crown was going to be a big fish, which I was going to make out of plaster and painted myself. And I did it, and I painted on it. Here you can see the process and some of the details that have emerged on this fish. First of all, I have an inexplicable tendency to draw imaginary and stylized birds. This is probably why the mouth of my fish has become like a bird's beak. One of its eyes has become sun and the other the moon. The fish's body was not covered with scales, but with the waves of the sea, fantastic animals and people houses. These photos are not in very high quality and you may find it difficult to see the objects that I'm mentioning, but they are there and they are there with a purpose. I wanted to make this fish as a source of life, the embodiment of all that is alive and beautiful, and it turned out to be very beautiful indeed. But the problem was that I couldn't find the right way to attach it to the cover of this book. Okay. Now you may be thinking that such a large and protruding object attached to the cover of a book is not comfortable anyway. And you would be right, in some sense. But I want to point out that my books often have protruding items on the cover because we are not meant to be shelved among other books. They often become part of the interior decor and the owner has to find a way to hold it comfortably in his or her arms in order to be able to enjoy its purpose. And this book was not to be an exemption. So I decided to sew it, the fish, to the cover with a thick twine. What a mistake it was. For an object to be sewn to the cover of a book, this must to be done before the cover is glued to the cardboard. So I sewed the fish on, but after gluing the cover material to the cardboard, I noticed that the tension of the object was too weak. So I pulled the string tighter to make the fish stick better to the cover. But as a result, part of the cover came off and it was not possible to undo it. I understand that it may be difficult to imagine from my story what it looked like, but in short, it was a disaster. It also didn't look as good as in my imagination. So, it is time to face the truth. You can have the vision, the sketch, the skill, the tools and expensive materials, the knowledge and the experience, and the project can still fail. And it wounded me deeply, so deeply, that I put this project aside for about, 10 months maybe. But here we are. The day has come when I am ready to finish the unfinished work and make something beautiful, even if it is not my first vision. And you know what? When I did that, some worries or sadness that had been buried deep inside me disappeared, and I became free from it. It is interesting how the human consciousness and psychology works, isn't it? So I made a ship out of eco leather scraps to hide the damaged parts of the book cover, and I think it did a great job. It is pity because the cover material was already glued to the cardboard, so I couldn't sew the ship on, but it still looks very good. By the way, I also decorated the end pages with small illustrations of my own, which I also sewed to the blue sheets of paper. And in the end, I think this book turned out amazing. Usually, if I don't have personal commissions, I make the books I like and then I sell them at art fairs. So that was the original intention of this book. But after everything I have been through with it, I decided to keep it for myself. Okay guys, thank you for being with me all this time and listening to my story. I am more than happy to be able to share my experiences with you, and I hope you have learned something important today from me. So now you can take a look at my web application Bookbindersbuddy if you want to print and bind a book at home yourself. Also, take a look at my Skillshare course and see you next week. Bye!